Kiribati, officially the Republic of Kiribati Gilbertese, '. Kiribati, is an independent island nation in the central Pacific Ocean. The permanent population is over 119,000,2020, more than half of whom live on Tarawa Atoll. The state comprises 32 atolls and one raised coral island, Banaba. They have a total land area of and are dispersed over. Their spread straddles the equator and the 180th meridian, although the international dateline goes round Kiribati and swings far to the east, almost reaching the 150 degrees W meridian. This brings Kiribati's easternmost islands, the Southern Line Islands south of Hawaii, into the same day as the Gilbert Islands and places them in the most advanced time zone on Earth, UTC+14. Kiribati is the only country in the world to be situated in all four hemispheres. Kiribati gained its independence from the United Kingdom, becoming a sovereign state in 1979. The capital, South Tarawa, now the most populated area, consists of a number of islets, connected by a series of causeways. These comprise about half the area of Tarawa Atoll. Prior to its independence, the country had exported phosphate. However, those mines are no longer viable, with fisheries and export of copper driving much of the economy. Kiribati is one of the least developed countries in the world and is highly dependent on international aid for its economy. Kiribati is a member of the Pacific Community SPC, Commonwealth of Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank, and became a full member of the United Nations in 1999 and also a member of the Pacific Islands Forum. As an island nation, the islands are very vulnerable to climate change, and addressing climate change has been a central part of its international policy, as a member of the Alliance of Small Island States.
Etymology and pronunciation.
The pronunciation differs. Kiribati is the normal pronunciation, as apostrophe T in the Gilbertese language represents an sound. The name Kiribati was adopted in 1979 at independence. It is the Gilbertese rendition of Gilberts, the plural of the English name of the nation's main archipelago, the Gilbert Islands. It was named Isles Gilbert, French for Gilbert Islands, in about 1820 by Russian Admiral Adam von Krusenstern and French Captain Louis Duperrey, after the British Captain Thomas Gilbert, and Captain John Marshall sighted some of the islands in 1788, while crossing the outer passage route from Port Jackson to Canton. Both von Krusenstern's and Duperrey's maps, published in 1824, were written in French. In English, the archipelago, particularly the southern part, was often referred to as the King's Mills in the 19th century, although the name Gilbert Islands was used increasingly, including in the Western Pacific Order in Council of 1877 and in the Pacific Order of 1893. The name Gilbert, already in the name of the British Protectorate since 1892, was incorporated into the name of the entire Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony GAIC from 1916 and was retained after the Ellice Islands became the separate nation of Tuvalu in 1976. The spelling of Gilberts in the Gilbertese language as Kiribati may be found in books in Gilbertese prepared by missionaries, but with the meaning of Gilbertese demonym and language C.E. G. Hawaiian Board of Missionaries, 1895. The first mention as a dictionary entry of the word Kiribati as the native name of the country was written down in 1952 by in his comprehensive dictionnaire Gilbert in Franchise. It is often suggested that the indigenous name for the Gilbert Islands proper is Tungaroo C.E. G. 1952 to 1953, or Arthur Grimble, 1989. However, the rendition Kiribati for Gilberts was chosen as the official name of the new independent nation by the Chief Minister, Sir Ieremia Tabai, and his cabinet, on such grounds that it was modern, and AD 1300. The area was not completely isolated. Later, settlers or voyagers from Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji introduced some Polynesian and Melanesian cultural aspects. respectively. Intermarriage and intense navigation between the islands tended to blur cultural differences and resulted in a significant degree of cultural homogenization. Local oral historians in the form of chiefly law keepers suggest that the area was first inhabited by a group of seafaring people from Melanesia, who were described as being dark-skinned, frizzy-haired and short in stature. These indigenous peoples were then visited by early Austronesian seafarers from the west, a place called Matang, orally described as being tall and fair-skinned. Eventually, both groups intermittently clashed and intermingled until they slowly became a uniform population. Around 1300 AD, there was a mass exodus from Samoa at the same time that cannibalism was forcefully abolished there, leading to the addition of Polynesian ancestry into the mix of most Gilbertese people. These Samoans would later bring strong features of Polynesian languages and culture, creating clans based on their own Samoan traditions and slowly intertwining with the indigenous clans and powers already dominant in Kiribati, around the 15th century, with the stark contrasting systems of governance between the northern islands, primarily under chiefly rule WWII, and the central and southern islands, primarily under the rule of their council of elders Unamwaina. WWII could be an exception as the sole island that is known as maintaining a traditional egalitarian society. The name WWII stems from the root phrase Tabutuia meaning chiefs are forbidden. Civil war soon became somehow a factor, with acquisition of land being the main form of conquest. Clans and chiefs began fighting over resources, fueled by hatred and reignited blood feuds, which may have started months or decades before. Thumbright 200px Portrait of a Native of the Makin Islands, drawn by Alfred Thomas Sagat 1841. The turmoil lasted well into the European visitation and colonial era, which led to certain islands decimating their foes with the help of guns and cannon-equipped ships that some Europeans were coerced into using by the more cunning and persuasive among the Kiribati leaders.
Colonial era.
The passing trade gave rise to European, Chinese, Samoan and other residents from the 1830s. They included beachcombers, castaways, traders and missionaries. In 1886, an Anglo-German agreement partitioned the unclaimed Central Pacific, leaving Nauru in the German sphere of influence, while Ocean Island and the future Gake wound up in the British sphere of influence. In 1892, local Gilbertese authorities and WWII, a chief from the Northern Gilbert Group, and Boaty or head of clan on each of the Gilbert Islands agreed to Captain E.H. M. Davis commanding HMS Royalist of the Royal Navy, declaring them part of a British protectorate, along with the nearby Ellice Islands. They were administered by a resident commissioner based first on Makin Islands 1893–95, then in Bitio, Tarawa 1896–1908 and Ocean Islands 1908–1942, Protectorate who was under the Western Pacific High Commission based in Fiji. Banaba, known to Europeans as Ocean Island, was added to the Protectorate in 1900, because of the phosphate rock of its soil discovered in 1900. This discovery and the mining ended the contracting of Kanaka's workers to farm plantations in Queensland, German Samoa or Central America, with all the needed workers being used in Ocean Island extraction. The conduct of William Telfer Campbell, the second resident commissioner of the Gilberts and Ellice Islands of 1896–1908, was criticized as to his legislative, judicial and administrative management, including allegations of forced labor exacted from islanders, and became the subject of the 1909 report by Arthur Mahaffey. In 1913, an anonymous correspondent to the New Age newspaper described the maladministration of W. Telfer Campbell and questioned the partiality of Arthur Mahaffey, because he was a former colonial official in the Gilberts. The anonymous correspondent also criticized the operations of the Pacific Phosphate Company on Ocean Island. Were added to the colony in 1919, and the Phoenix Islands were added in 1937 with the purpose of a Phoenix Islands settlement scheme. On the 12th of July 1940, Pan Am Airways American Clipper landed at Canton Island for the first time during a flight from Honolulu to Auckland. Sir Arthur Grimble was a cadet administrative officer based at Tarawa 1913 to 1919 and became resident commissioner of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands Colony in 1926. In 1902, the Pacific Cable Board laid the first trans-Pacific telegraph cable from Bamfield, British Columbia to Fanning Island Taburan in the Line Islands, and from Fiji to Fanning Island, thus completing the All-Red Line, a series of telegraph lines circumnavigating the globe completely within the British Empire. The location of Fanning Island, one of the closest formations to Hawaii, led to its annexation by the British Empire in 1888. Nearby candidates including Palmyra Island were not favoured due to the lack of adequate landing sites. The United States eventually incorporated the Northern Line Islands into its territories, and did the same with the Phoenix Islands, which lie between Gilbert's and the Line Islands, including Howland, Jarvis, and Baker Islands, thus causing a territorial dispute that was eventually resolved, and they finally became part of Kiribati under the Treaty of Tarawa. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, during World War II, Butaritari and Tarawa, and others of the Northern Gilbert Group, were occupied by Japan from 1941 to 1943. Pattaya became an airfield and supply base. The expulsion of the Japanese military in late 1943 involved one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. Marine Corps history. Marines landed in November 1943 and the Battle of Tarawa ensued. Ocean Island, where were the headquarters of the colony, was bombed, evacuated and occupied by Japan in 1942 and only freed in 1945, after the massacre of all but one Bonobans by the Japanese forces. Funafuti hosted then the provisional headquarters of the colony from 1942 to 1946, when Tarawa returned to host the headquarters, replacing Ocean Island. At the end of 1945, most of the remaining inhabitants of Bonobo, repatriated from Kosrae and Tarawa, were relocated to Rabi Island, a land of Fiji that the British government had acquired in 1942 for this purpose. On the 1st of January 1953, the British governor of the colony was transferred in the new capital of Honiara, to the British Solomon Islands, with the Gilbert's resident commissioner still headquartered in Tarawa. Further military operations in the colony occurred in the late 1950s and early 1960s when Christmas Island was used by the United States and United Kingdom for nuclear weapons testing, including hydrogen bombs. Institutions of internal self-rule were established on Tarawa from about 1967. The Ellice Islands asked for separation from the rest of the colony in 1974 and granted their own internal self-rule institutions. The separation entered into force on the 1st of January 1976. In 1978, the Ellice Islands became the independent nation of Tuvalu.
Independence.
The Gilbert Islands gained independence as the Republic of Kiribati on the 12th of July 1979. Then, in September, the United States relinquished all claims to the sparsely inhabited Phoenix and Line Islands, in a 1979 Treaty of Friendship with Kiribati ratified in 1983. Although the indigenous Gilbertese name for the Gilbert Islands proper is Tungaroo, the new state chose the name Kiribati, the Gilbertese spelling of Gilberts, because it was more modern and as an equivalent of the former colony to acknowledge the inclusion of Bonobo, the Line Islands, and the Phoenix Islands. The last two archipelagos were never initially occupied by Gilbertese until the British authorities, and later the Republic government, resettled Gilbertese there under resettlement schemes. In 1982, the first elections since independence were held. A no-confidence vote provoked the 1983 new election. In the post-independence era, overcrowding has been an issue, at least in British and aid organisations' eyes. In 1988, an announcement was made that 4,700 residents of the main island group would be resettled onto less populated islands. In September 1994, Teburo Ratito from the opposition was elected president. In 1995, Kiribati unilaterally moved the international date line far to the east to encompass the Line Islands group, so that the nation would no longer be divided by the date line. The move, which fulfilled one of President Tito's campaign promises, was intended to allow businesses across the expansive nation to keep the same business week. This also enabled Kiribati to become the first country to see the dawn of the third millennium, an event of significance for tourism. Tito was re-elected in 1998. In 1999, Kiribati became a full member of the United Nations, 20 years after independence. In 2002, Kiribati passed a controversial law that enabled the government to shut down newspaper publishers. The legislation followed the launching of Kiribati's first successful non-government-run newspaper. President Tito was re-elected in 2003 but was removed from office in March 2003 by a no-confidence vote and replaced by a Council of State. Enote Tong of the opposition party Bautok Kor was elected to succeed Tito in July 2003. He was re-elected in 2007 and in 2011. In June 2008, Kiribati officials asked Australia and New Zealand to accept Kiribati citizens as permanent refugees. Kiribati is expected to be the first country to lose all its land territory to climate change. In June 2008, the Kiribati president Enote Tong said that the country had reached the point of no return. He added, "To plan for the day when you no longer have a country is indeed painful, but I think we have to do that." In January 2012, Enote Tong was re-elected for a third and last successive term. In early 2012, the government of Kiribati purchased the 2,200-hectare Natovatu estate on the second-largest island of Fiji, Vanuatu. At the time it was widely reported that the government planned to evacuate the entire population of Kiribati to Fiji. In April 2013, President Tong began urging citizens to evacuate the islands and migrate elsewhere. In May 2014, the office of the president confirmed the purchase of some 5,460 acres of land on Vanuatu at a cost of $9.3 million Australian dollars.
Politics.
The Constitution of Kiribati, promulgated the 12th of July 1979, provides for free and open elections in a parliamentary democratic republic. The executive branch consists of a president Beretitenti, a vice president and a cabinet. The president, who is also chief of the cabinet, is directly elected by the citizens, after the legislature nominates 3 or 4 persons from among its members to be candidates in the ensuing presidential election. The president is limited in the terms they can serve for to 3 4-year terms. He remains a member of the assembly while serving as president. The cabinet is composed of the president, vice president, and 13 ministers appointed by the president who are also MPs. Ad hoc opposition groups tend to coalesce around specific issues. There is universal suffrage at age 18. There were 3 resident diplomatic missions headquartered in Kiribati, the embassies of the Republic of China Taiwan until 2019, replaced by China in 2020, and the High Commissions of Australia and New Zealand. In November 1999, Kiribati agreed to allow Japan's National Space Development Agency to lease land on Christmas Island for 20 years, on which to build a spaceport. The agreement stipulated that Japan was to pay $840,000 per year and would also pay for any damage to roads and the environment. And an abandoned airfield on the island was designated as the landing strip for a proposed reusable unmanned space shuttle called HopeX. HopeX, however, was eventually cancelled by Japan in 2003. As one of the world's most vulnerable nations to the effects of global warming, Kiribati has been an active participant in international diplomatic efforts relating to climate change, most importantly the UNFC conferences of the parties COP. Kiribati is a member of the Alliance of Small Island States (OSIS), an intergovernmental organization of low-lying coastal and small island countries, established in 1990. The main purpose of the alliance is to consolidate the voices of small island developing states SIDS to address global warming. OSIS has been very active from its inception, putting forward the first draft text in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations as early as 1994. In 2009, President Tong attended the Climate Vulnerable Forum V11 in the Maldives, with 10 other countries that are vulnerable to climate change, and signed the Bandos Island Declaration on the 10th of November 2009, pledging to show moral leadership and commence greening their economies by voluntarily committing to achieving carbon neutrality. In November 2010, Kiribati hosted the Tarawa Climate Change Conference (TCCC) to support the president of Kiribati's initiative to hold a consultative forum between vulnerable states and their partners. The conference strove to create an enabling environment for multi-party negotiations under the auspices of the UNFC. The conference was a successor event to the Climate Vulnerable Forum. The ultimate objective of TCCC was to reduce the number and intensity of fault lines between parties to the COP process, explore elements of agreement between the parties and thereby to support Kiribati's and other parties' contribution to COP16 held in Cancun, Mexico, from 29 November to 10 December 2010. In 2013, President Tong spoke of climate change-induced sea level rise as inevitable. For our people to survive, then they will have to migrate. Either we can wait for the time when we have to move people en masse, or we can prepare them, beginning from now. In New York in 2014, per The New Yorker, President Tong told the New York Times that according to the projections, within this century, the water will be higher than the highest point in our lands. In 2014, President Tong finalized the purchase of a stretch of land on Vanuatu, one of the larger Fiji Islands, 2,000 kilometers away. A move described by Tong as an absolute necessity should the nation be completely submerged underwater. In 2013, attention was drawn to a claim of a Kiribati man of being a climate change refugee under the Convention relating to the status of refugees 1951. However, this claim was determined by the New Zealand High Court to be untenable. The New Zealand Court of Appeal also rejected the claim in a 2014 decision. On further appeal, the New Zealand Supreme Court confirmed the earlier adverse rulings against the application for refugee status, but rejected the proposition that environmental degradation resulting from climate change or other natural disasters could never create a pathway into the Refugee Convention or protected person jurisdiction. In 2017, Kiribati signed the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. On the 20th of September 2019, the government of Kiribati restored its diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China and simultaneously stopped its diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. China offered a 737 aircraft and ferries to Kiribati for the decision, according to Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu.
Law enforcement in military.
Law enforcement in Kiribati is carried out by the Kiribati Police Service, which is responsible for all law enforcement and paramilitary duties for the island nation. There are police posts located on all of the islands. The police have one patrol boat, the Pacific-class patrol boat RKST No I. Kiribati has no military and relies on both Australia and New Zealand for its defence. The main prison in Kiribati is located in Bitio, named the Walter Bitio Prison. There is also a prison in London on Kiribati. Male homosexuality is illegal in Kiribati, with a penalty up to 14 years in prison, according to a historical British law, but this law is not enforced. Kiribati has not yet followed the lead of the United Kingdom, following its Wolfenden report, to decriminalise acts of male homosexuality, beginning with provisions in the UK's Sexual Offences Act 1957. Female homosexuality is legal, but lesbians may face violence and discrimination. However, employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is prohibited.
Administrative divisions.
There are 21 inhabited islands in Kiribati. Kiribati is divided geographically into 3 island groups, including a group that unites the Line Islands and the Phoenix Islands Ministry at London, Kiribati Island. The groups that represent archipelagos have no administrative function. They are Gilbert Islands, Phoenix Islands, in one of the largest marine protected areas on Earth, was largest from 2008 to 2010. Line Islands. The original districts before independence were Banaba Ocean Island, Tarawa Atoll, Northern Gilbert Islands, Central Gilbert Islands, Southern Gilbert Islands, Line Islands. Four of the former districts including Tarawa lie in the Gilbert Islands, where most of the country's population lives. 5 of the Line Islands are uninhabited: Malden Island, Starbuck Island, Caroline Island, Vostok Island and Flint Island. The Phoenix Islands are uninhabited except for Canton, and have no representation. Banaba itself is sparsely inhabited now. There is also an unelected representative of the Banabans on Rabi Island in Fiji. Each of the 21 inhabited islands, the majority of Kiribati, including the capital, is not first. For example, New Zealand UTC +13 in January has an earlier New Year.
Environmental issues.
According to the Pacific Regional Environment Program, previously South Pacific Regional Environment Program, 2 small uninhabited Kiribati islets, Tebua Tarawa and Abanuia, disappeared underwater in 1999. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that sea levels will rise by about 50 centimeters 20 in by 2100 due to global warming, and a further rise would be inevitable. It is thus likely that within a century the nation's arable land will become subject to increased soil salination and will be largely submerged. The exposure of Kiribati to changes in sea levels is exacerbated by the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a climate switch phenomenon that results in changes from periods of La Nina to periods of El Nino. This has an effect on sea levels. For example, in 2000, there was a switch from periods of downward pressure of El Nino on sea levels to an upward pressure of La Nina on sea levels, which upward pressure causes more frequent and higher high tide levels. The peregrine spring tide, often called a king tide, can result in seawater flooding low-lying areas of the islands of Kiribati. The atolls and reef islands can respond to changes in sea level. Paul Kench at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and Arthur Webb at the South Pacific Applied Geoscience Commission in Fiji released a study in 2010 on the dynamic response of atolls and reef islands in the Central Pacific. Kiribati was mentioned in the study, and Webb and Kench found that the 3 major urbanized islands in Kiribati, Bitio, Beriki and Nanakai, increased by 30%, 36 hectares, 16.3%, 5.8 hectares and 12.5%, 0.8 hectares, respectively. The study by Paul Kench and Arthur Webb recognizes that the islands are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, and concluded that this study did not measure vertical growth of the island surface, nor does it suggest there is any change in the height of the islands. Since land height has not changed, the vulnerability of the greater part of the land area of each island to submergence due to sea level rise is also unchanged, and these low-lying atolls remain immediately and extremely vulnerable to inundation or seawater flooding. However, in March 2015, Kiribati experienced flooding and destruction of seawalls and coastal infrastructure as the result of Cyclone Pam, a Category 5 cyclone that devastated Vanuatu. Kiribati remains exposed to the risk that cyclones can strip the low-lying islands of their vegetation and soil. Gradual sea level rise also allows for coral polyp activity to raise the atolls with the sea level. However, if the increase in sea level occurs at a rate faster than coral growth, or if polyp activity is damaged by ocean acidification, then the resilience of the atolls and reef islands is less certain. Also, coral bleaching has occurred on more than 60% of the coral reefs in the Maldives. The Kiribati Adaptation Program (CAP), started in 2003, is a $5 million initiative that was originally enacted by the national government of Kiribati with the support of the Global Environment Facility (GEF), the World Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, and the Japanese government. Australia later joined the coalition, donating $1.5 million to the effort. The program aims to take place over 6 years, supporting measures that reduce Kiribati's vulnerability to the effects of climate change and sea level rise by raising awareness of climate change, assessing and protecting available water resources, and managing inundation. At the start of the adaptation program, representatives from each of the inhabited atolls identified key climatic changes that had taken place over the past 20 to 40 years and proposed coping mechanisms to deal with these changes under 4 categories of urgency of need. The program is now focusing on the country's most vulnerable sectors in the most highly populated areas. Initiatives include improving water supply management in and around Tarawa, coastal management protection measures such as mangrove replantation and protection of public infrastructure, strengthening laws to reduce coastal erosion, and population settlement planning to reduce personal risks.
Climate.
Kiribati has a tropical rainforest climate of. From April to October, there are predominant northeastern winds and stable temperatures close to. From November to March, western gales bring rain. The fair season starts when Tenrimwimatu Antares appears in the sky after sunset, from May to November, when more gentle winds and currents and less rain. Then towards December, when Naughty Pleiades replaces Antares, the season of sudden westerly winds and more heavy rain discourages any far travel from island to island. Kiribati does not experience cyclones, but effects may occasionally be experienced during cyclone seasons affecting nearby Pacific island countries such as Fiji.
Ecology.
Kiribati contains 3 ecosystems: Central Polynesian tropical moist forests, Eastern Micronesia tropical moist forests, and Western Polynesian tropical moist forests. Because of the relatively young geological age of the islands and atolls and high level of soil salination, the flora of Kiribati is somewhat unhealthy. The Gilbert Islands contain about 83 indigenous and 306 introduced plants, whereas the corresponding numbers for Line and Phoenix Islands are 67 and 283. None of these species are endemic, and about half of the indigenous ones have a limited distribution and became endangered or nearly extinct due to human activities such as phosphate mining, coconut, pandanus palms, and Encyclopedia Britannica Access Date 2017-07-12 Language N, whereas the 5 most cultivated crops but the traditional babai, Cytosperma mercusii, are imported Chinese cabbage, pumpkin, tomato, watermelon and cucumber. Over 80% of the population participates in either farming or fishing. Seaweed farming is an important part of the economy, with 2 major species Eucheuma aucarsii and Eucheuma spinosum introduced to the local lagoons from the Philippines in 1977. It competes with collection of the black-lipped pearl oyster, pink Darda margaritifera and shellfish, which are dominated by the stramid gastropods Strombislophelus and Anodara cockles Anodara europigimilana, whereas the stocks of the giant clamtride cnagigas have been largely exhausted. Kiribati has a few land mammals, none being indigenous or endemic. They include the Polynesian rat Rattus exulans, dogs, cats and pigs. Among the 75 bird species, the Bokikokiko Acrocephalus echinoctialus is endemic to Kiribati. There are 600 to 800 species of insurant pelagic finfish, some 200 species of corals and about 1,000 species of shellfish. Fishing mostly targets the family Scombridae, particularly the skipjack tuna and yellowfin tuna, as well as flying fish Cypsilurus spp. Dogs were already accompanying the first inhabitants but were reintroduced by European settlers. They have continued to grow in numbers and are roaming in traditional packs, particularly around South Tarawa.
Economy.
Kiribati has few natural resources. Commercially viable phosphate deposits on Banaba were exhausted at the time of independence. Copra and fish now represent the bulk of production and exports. Kiribati is considered one of the least developed countries in the world. In one form or another, Kiribati gets a large portion of its income from abroad. Examples include fishing licenses, development assistance, workers' remittances, especially the seafarers issued from Marine Training Center, and a few tourists. Given Kiribati's limited domestic production ability, it must import nearly all of its essential foodstuffs and manufactured items. It depends on these external sources of income for financing. The economy of Kiribati benefits from international development assistance programs. The multilateral donors providing development assistance in 2009 were the European Union $9 million, the United Nations Development Programme $3 7 million, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization $100,000. The major donors in 2010-2011 were Australia $15 million, Taiwan $11 million, New Zealand $6 million, the World Bank $4 million, and the Asian Development Bank. In 1956, Gilbert and Ellice Islands established a sovereign wealth fund to act as a store of wealth for the country's earnings from phosphate mining. In 2008, the Revenue Equalization Reserve Fund was valued at $400 million. The REF assets declined from $637 million, 420% of GDP in 2007 to $570 5,350% of GDP in 2009 with a number of branches and ATM units.
Transport.
Kiribati has had two domestic airlines, Air Kiribati and Coral Sun Airways. Both airlines are based in Tarawa's Bonriki International Airport and serve destinations across the Gilbert Islands only. Bonobo and the Phoenix Islands are not served by the domestic carriers. Kasadi International Airport on Kiribati has an international service provided by Fiji Airways, Nadi to Kasadi Airport and then to Honolulu.
Demographics.
The November 2020 census showed a population of 119,940. About 90% lived in the Gilbert Islands, with 52.9% of them on South Tarawa, including Bitio, the biggest township. Until recently, people lived mostly in villages with populations between 50 and 3,000 on the outer islands. Most houses are made of materials obtained from coconut and pandanus trees. Frequent droughts and infertile soil hinder reliable large-scale agriculture, so the islanders have largely turned to the sea for livelihood and subsistence. Most are outrigger sailors and fishermen. Copper plantations serve as a second source of employment. In recent years large numbers of citizens have moved to the more urban island capital of Tarawa, where Bitio is the largest town and South Tarawa reunites larger towns like Bikini Bay or Tiararik. Increasing urbanization has raised the population of South Tarawa to 63,017. Recent archaeological evidence indicates that Austronesians originally settled the islands thousands of years ago. Around the 14th century, Fijians, Samoans, and Tongans invaded the islands, thus diversifying the ethnic range and introducing Polynesian linguistic traits. Intermarriage among all ancestral groups, however, has led to a population reasonably homogeneous in appearance and traditions, which has its origins in the Kiribati people hearing the European settlers saying "come here" to their dogs, and adopting that as "came here." Many other loan words have been adopted like bun, spoon, moko, smoke, beaky, pig, batera, bottle, but some typical Gilbertese words are quite common, even for European objects like wanikiba, plane, the flying canoe, rebu, motorbike, for the motor noise, cornewi, shoes, the cow for the feet.
Religion.
Christianity is the major religion in Kiribati, having been introduced by missionaries in the 19th century. The population is predominantly Catholic 57.3%, with Protestant denominations Kiribati Protestant Church, then Kiribati Uniting Church accounting for 31.3%. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints 5.3%, Baha'i Faith 2.1%, Seventh-day Adventist Church 1.9%, Pentecostals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others small faiths account all for less than 10%. 2015 census.
Health.
The Gilbert Islands, where 90% of Kiribati population is living, boasts some of the highest population densities in the Pacific, rivaling, without any tall building, cities like Hong Kong or Singapore. This overcrowding provokes a great amount of pollution, worsening the quality and length of life, due to insufficient sanitation and water filtration systems, worsened by the fragility of the waterlands of the atolls and by climate change. Only about 66% have access to clean water. Waterborne diseases grow at record levels throughout the islands. Poor sanitation has led to an increase in cases of conjunctivitis, diarrhea, dysentery, and fungal infections. Around 60% of adults smoke tobacco products on a regular basis, the highest proportion in the world. Due to this and other lifestyle diseases, such as diabetes, there has been a drastic spike in amputations on the islands, doubling in a few years. As a consequence, the population of Kiribati has a quite low life expectancy at birth of 46 years, even if this data is of only 9 years, provided elsewhere. Kiribati ranks last in life expectancy out of the 20 nations of Oceania. This life expectancy is 64.3 for males, and 69.5 for females, and there is an infant mortality rate of 41 deaths per 1,000 live births. Government expenditure on health was at $268 per capita PPP in 2006. In 1990 to 2007, there were 23 physicians per 100,000 persons. Since the arrival of Cuban doctors in 2006, the infant mortality rate has decreased significantly. Most health problems are related to consumption of semi-raw seafood, limited food storage facilities, and bacterial contamination of freshwater supplies. In the early 2000s, between 1 and 7% of the population, depending on the island, were annually treated for food poisoning in a hospital. Modernization and cross-cultural exchange of the late 20th century brought new issues of unhealthy diet and lifestyle, heavy smoking, especially among the young, and external infections, including HIV/AIDS. Kiribati is the country with the third highest prevalence of smoking, with 54% of the population reported as smokers. Freshwater remains a concern of Kiribati. During the dry season or Mayaki, water has been drilled for instead of using rainwater tanks. In recent years, there has been a longer than usual or Makai season, resulting in additional water having to be drilled from beneath the water table. This has introduced waterborne illnesses, compounding the health problems within Kiribati.
Education.
Primary education is free and compulsory for the first 6 years, now being extended to 9 years from 6 to 14 years. Mission schools are slowly being absorbed into the government primary school system. Higher education is expanding. Students may seek technical, teacher or marine training, or study in other countries. The education system is organized as follows: preschool for childhood from 1 to 6 years. Junior secondary school Form 1 to 3 from 7 to 9, Senior secondary school Form 4 to 7 from 10 to 13. Kiribati Ministry of Education is the education ministry. The government high schools are King George V and Elaine Bernanke School, WWII North Senior Secondary School, and Melenji Tabai Secondary School. 13 high schools are operated by Christian churches. The University of the South Pacific has a campus in Tirarik for distant, flexible learning, but also to provide preparatory studies towards obtaining certificates, diplomas and degrees at other campus sites. The other prominent schools in Kiribati are, the Marine Training Center in Bitio, the Kiribati Institute of Technology, the Fisheries Training Center, the Kiribati School of Nursing, the Kiribati Police Academy, the Kiribati Teachers College.
Culture.
Songs Tanin and above all, dances Tmwei, are held in high regard.
Music.
Kiribati folk music is generally based on chanting or other forms of vocalizing, accompanied by body percussion. Public performances in modern Kiribati are generally performed by a seated chorus, accompanied by a guitar. However, during formal performances of the standing danced Kaimatoa or the hip danced buki, a wooden box is used as a percussion instrument. This box is constructed to give a hollow and reverberating tone when struck simultaneously by a chorus of men sitting around it. Traditional songs are often love-themed, but there are also competitive, religious, children's, patriotic, war and wedding songs. There are also stick dances which accompany legends and semi-historical stories. These stick dances, or tai pronounced siri, are performed only during major festivals.
Dance.
The uniqueness of Kiribati when compared with other forms of Pacific Island dance is its emphasis on the outstretched arms of the dancer and the sudden bird-like movement of the head. The frigate bird Frigata minor on the Kiribati flag refers to this bird-like style of Kiribati dancing. Most dances are in the standing or sitting position with movement limited and staggered. Smiling whilst dancing is generally considered vulgar within the context of Kiribati dancing. This is due to its origin of not being solely as a form of entertainment but as a form of storytelling and a display of the skill, beauty and endurance of the dancer.
Cuisine.
Traditionally, the staple diet of the Kiribati was the abundance of seafood and coconuts. Starch-based carbohydrate sources were not plentiful due to the hostile climate of the atolls, with only the northernmost atolls being viable for constant agriculture. The national crop WWII was only eaten during special celebrations along with pork. WWII cultivation in Butaritari to complement the rather low consumption of carbohydrates in their diets. The Kiribati processed the sap and fruit of the abundant pandanus and coconut trees into different beverages and foods, such as tke fresh daily sap of the coconut tree, or tue dried pandanus cake, and tkababu dried pandanus flour from pandanus fruit pulp, and tkame mai coconut sap syrup from coconut sap. After World War II, rice became a daily staple in most households, which is still the case today. Majority of seafood, fish in particular, is eaten sashimi style with either coconut sap, soy sauce or vinegar-based dressings in use, often combined with chilies and onions. Coconut crabs and mud crabs are traditionally given to breastfeeding mothers, with the belief that the meat stimulates the production of good quality breast milk.
Sport.
Kiribati has competed at the Commonwealth Games since 1998 and the Summer Olympics since 2004. It sent 3 competitors to its first Olympics, 2 sprinters and a weightlifter. Kiribati won its first ever Commonwealth Games medal at the 2014 Commonwealth Games when weightlifter David Katotau won gold in the 105 kg group. Football is the most popular sport. Kiribati Islands Football Federation (KIF) is an associate member of the Oceania Football Confederation, but not of world governing body FIFA. Kiribati national team has played 10 matches, all of which it has lost, and all at the Pacific Games from 1979 to 2011. The Kiribati football stadium is Bariki National Stadium, which has a capacity of 2,500. The is home to a number of local sporting teams.
Outside perspectives.
Edward Carlin Elliott, who was resident commissioner of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, now Kiribati and Tuvalu, from 1913 to 1920, describes this period in his book Broken Atoms: Autobiographical Reminiscences, Pub. G. Bulls, London, 1938. Sir Arthur Grimble wrote about his time working in the British Colonial Service in Kiribati, then the Gilbert Islands, from 1914 to 1932 in 2 popular books, A Pattern of Islands 1952 and Return to the Islands 1957. He also undertook academic studies of Gilbertese culture. John Smith, the last governor of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, wrote his memoir An Island in the autumn 2011. J. Martin Trust's more recent autobiographical experiences in Tarawa are documented in his book ''.